Good morning, everyone. So if the summer has been too warm for you, I have found a solution. Yesterday was nice. Yesterday was really nice. But I gave blood on Friday, and if you do double, they'll pump a quart of saline back into you. And I've been really cold ever since, as I've been trying to recover from that. So if you think today's too warm, go give blood somewhere, do double platelets, and you'll cool off really quick, and it kind of hangs around for a while. I've had a chill most of the time since Friday. Galatians chapter 2. We're going to pick back up. We're going to back up a little bit, verse 15-ish. Actually, 17 is the first verse on this slide. Is the microphone turned up too loud? It seems like I'm louder than usual. Okay, nobody's objecting.
Echoing in your own head.
I'm echoing in my own head. Could very well be. So we're talking about justification. In chapter 2, we began with a consideration of the Council of Jerusalem that Paul mentions here in a discussion about, okay, I received stuff directly from God. You received stuff directly from God. Did we receive the same thing? The answer was yes. No surprise there. Also, remember the poor. And then once that's been established that they were in agreement, he goes through the conversation that he had with Cephas, that is Peter, in Antioch, because of his hypocrisy concerning his relationship with the Gentiles there and how he is behaving towards them. And as I mentioned last week, I believe he is recounting the conversation he had with Peter through the end of chapter 2. Okay, he's not speaking, he's speaking directly to the Gentiles throughout the entire book, but verses 14 through 21 specifically, he's saying, look, this is what I quoted to Peter, essentially. This is what I said to him. Verse 15, we are Jews by nature, and not sinners from among the Gentiles. Nevertheless, knowing that a man is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Christ Jesus, even we have believed in Christ Jesus, so that we may be justified by faith in Christ, and not by the works of the law. Key concept, since by the works of the law, capital L, law of Moses, no flesh will be justified. Verse 17, but if while seeking to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have also been found sinners, is Christ then a minister of sin? May it never be, for if I rebuild what I have once destroyed, I prove myself to be a transgressor. If we claim Christ as our salvation, yet continue to sin, what is the situation there? Okay, and we know this happens. We can say that there's lots of people who claim to be followers or believers of Christ, to be Christians, yet they continue to sin. And so the world, different theologies respond to this different ways. I say theologies very loosely. But how do we handle this? Has Christ been unable to conquer sin? There's a group of people out there that say, well, particularly the people who adhere to the once saved, always saved idea, that if you have been saved and sinned, then in retrospect you were never saved to begin with. In which case, one way you could go with that is either you weren't sincere, or you could go with, well, Christ tried and failed with you. That's another logical outcome you could get from that line of reasoning. Well, you were saved and Christ kind of applied his grace, but his grace didn't stick, and that's somehow his fault. It's one or the other. But then when we consider this in light of our own behavior, who do we represent? What does Christ represent? Who does Christ represent? Verse 19, which we'll get to in just a moment, for through the law I died to the law so that I might live to God. We need to recognize the fact that through our salvation we die to our old self. Romans talks about that extensively, and we'll be going back and forth in Romans 6 a fair bit through this section coming up here. So if we claim Christ as our justification, we are claiming Christ. That is supposed to require a change of behavior in us. That does not necessarily indicate a change in our personality. Okay, this is something that takes place through effort. Christ wipes away the sin, but we are still responsible for our own behavior. Questions, comments?
First John, chapter 1 and 2, it tells us that he is speaking to Christians, he is speaking to the church, and we do sin. Yet what they're describing in this, as well as in First John, is a continuation or a habitual sin. For us, we have an avenue when we do sin against God, that we can come before God through Jesus Christ and seek forgiveness. And his blood washes away all unrighteousness, all sin. As we walk in the light, as we are in the light, we have fellowship, and that we do make mistakes, we do sin, and we shouldn't say that just because we become Christians, we do not sin, because we would be found a liar, as the Bible tells us.
As I was mentioning in the last class, verse 9 of chapter 2, recognize the grace that had been given to me. James, Cephas, and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave us the right hand of fellowship. Pillars, they've received the same word, but then verse 11, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him because he stood condemned. An inspired apostle who just verses before had been confirmed as somebody who had received the word of God from God himself and was practicing it correctly. Something changed between then and now. So yes, sin can take place. And Galatians is like Proverbs in the sense that there's a section here that kind of makes the same point over and over and over again. And so we talked a little bit last week about the idea of, yes, you can indeed lose your salvation, and we'll probably bump into that again, but I'm trying to get different points from passages that are making the same overall point without spending too much time laboring over the same thing over and over again, and I probably don't do that as well as I could. If we could, sorry, I was looking to see if I had made a previous point on the slides. It had only been in my notes. Has Christ been able to conquer sin? Who do we represent? I'm just trying to catch up here again. Okay, so does this prove salvation is simply permission to sin without consequences? Right? Absolutely not. Romans, in fact, that's almost a direct quote. May it never be, right? Romans 6. I got to find my Romans. What shall we say then? Are we to continue to sin so that grace may increase? May it never be. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? So, we see that at the very least, Paul is consistent with himself. He's not trying to trick anybody here. So this salvation, if we claim to be justified through Christ, this does not give us justification for bad behavior. It gives us justification in terms of new sanctification without the old law. 18, if we prop up what Christ removed, we violate the will of Christ. Look at this again. For if I rebuild what I have once destroyed, I prove myself to be a transgressor. This would be more potent or poignant or specific in terms of the concept, I think, to the Jews who had practiced the old law. We're not justified under the old laws. They begin to realize this now, that yes, I practiced this thing, but I was not justified by it. My salvation destroyed the works of the flesh, which is represented by the old law. How can I continue to do these things? So he's starting to kind of blend here, I think, the idea of a fleshly old law and even sin itself. How much effort did God put into establishing the new covenant? Well, that whole only Son left heaven, came to earth, and died is a pretty significant effort, right? Not to mention, if you look how this played out through prophecy and all that, like we're looking at in Isaiah, through the old law, we know that a lot of effort was put into that. But I mean, I say effort in man-made terms. God went to what us seems like great lengths for us. So I think what he's saying here is that if you practice the old law still, it's not just a matter of you've missed the point, but it's that you're still practicing fleshly things. You have negated God's purpose in every way for the entirety of the prophets and the law of Moses being a shadow and a foretelling of what was coming. God sends his Son, he dies to wipe away those things. He nailed them to the cross, it talks about, right? Okay. And here we are. You're still interested in practicing these things. It's not like, oh, well, fun family traditions. When you become a new man, particularly for the Jews who have been practicing the old law, you need to get rid of these things. You need to get rid of these things. It's not just that you've missed the point, it's that you are still in your transgressions if you are requiring the old law to justify you.
Go back.
Yeah.
What do you think, in 18 he says, if I rebuilt what I tore down, what do you think he's referring to there?
I guess my assumption is that he's just gone, so again, I think he's quoting his conversation to Peter. Okay, and I think what he's saying is, Peter, look, and he's using he's using himself as an example to try to more gently say to Peter, look, we're pointing out here that we have destroyed this old law thing by the return of Christ. Why are you trying to prop it back up? I think that's what's going on here. We've torn this down by the gospel we've tried to present. Look, law of Moses is not necessary. Dismantle that concept. And now here you are behaving as though you're supporting it. You're building it back up. You're what are you doing? Holding up the wall? Well, yeah, he is. So that's what's going on there. Does that kind of fit?
Well, it's nowhere where I was going.
Okay.
But that's fine. I'm not. I guess I never considered that he was still
Talking with Peter.
talking with Peter here.
There's
There's quotations.
conflict
Yeah.
about that.
But Paul did not tear down the law, not in the sense that Jesus did.
No.
I mean, Jesus fulfilled the law, and in fulfilling it, made it of no effect anymore.
I kind of assumed he was using the words he was using was a.
Yeah, I get the sense he's writing the Philippians. I know he's writing the Philippians, or the Galatians here.
Yeah.
And he's saying, look, he tore something down. I think what he tore down is their understanding. When he taught them initially, the law is no longer of an effect. Okay? He took down their understanding of how important the law was. Okay?
Right.
And now he says, if I tore that down, why would I be rebuilding it again?
That's essentially what I was saying.
Yeah,
only I'm
that's-
suggesting he was
that's
saying
the
it
same
to
sort of
Peter
point,
directly,
yeah.
and then by extension the Galatians here.
Right.
So the idea, so whether he's saying it to Peter or not, the idea is, look, we have spent a lot of time trying to work on everybody's perspective of the law is necessary. No, it's not necessary. No, it's not necessary. No, it's not necessary. Why would you see? And so this is how it explains. This is why I think it's more inclined to be spoken to Peter. For if I rebuild what I once destroyed, well, who could he say that to most directly at the moment? In context, to Peter, he would be using the illustration of his conversation for principles that he's going to discuss with the Galatians in chapter 3. I think the point of him recounting what he said to Peter from 11 through 21 is to make it clear to the Galatians that, yes, it's an issue, and yes, I'm trying to be consistent across the board here. What I said to Peter, I'm now going to say to you. And that is, we've worked on tearing this down. Why prop it back up there?
Right.
It's torn down. We're trying to get rid of this thing.
The Galatians were Gentiles, right?
Yes.
Yeah, there was a mix.
Okay, well, I said to Cephas, and then that sentence specifically, the whole Gentiles live like Jews thing, is clearly to him, and then we have a break that some guy put there for whatever reason.
Mhm.
It is a little bit of a different section, but then we ourselves are Jews by birth. Unless they were all Jews,
Oh, right.
that would seem to be to Peter.
Yeah.
So then you've at least bridged that little gap, and if you've
Right.
bridged that little gap, then who really knows where to draw the line, but something in there is to Peter. Or, yeah.
Continues the we thing.
Right. So the process I went through, so to make me come up here and say, I think through 21 is still a conversation with Peter. I'll just tell you what happened. I read this and went, I'm not really sure, but it kind of seems like through 21 because of verse like 15. We are Jews by nature. I thought verse 18 that we were discussing, I prove myself to be a transgressor, was a personal part of this conversation he's having. He's saying, what he's really saying is, you, Peter, if you do this, you prove yourself. But rather than, he's trying to use some tact there. But I wasn't sure. So I looked at a bunch of commentaries, and a bunch of commentaries said one thing, and a bunch said another, and a bunch other commentaries say different things. And so I went back here and said, you know what, verse 21 sounds pretty good. That's what I'm going to go with. So that was the process. It could be different. Certainly the message, whether to Peter or the Galatians, remains the same there.
He opposed him to his face, but still read it to say, "Oh, foolish Peter."
Yeah, yeah, right. Let's see here. 19. I have a question here. For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. Oh boy, I should have spent a little more time reviewing this particular verse before I got up here this morning. I spent a long time on this when I first studied it, and I spent a while on it a couple weeks ago when I was refreshing my mind to come back to these things, but I didn't look at it as closely as I should have this morning. Is the word law here being used two different ways?
I think so.
That's the only note I have here on this at the moment. For through the law I died to the law so that I might live to God.
Through the law of Christ, I died to the law
See,
of Moses.
I know it's a long story, but I do not have my paper notes with me this morning, so I'm struggling a little bit.
I
Yes.
think just one way.
Okay.
And
I've got a question mark there for a legitimate reason. I looked at it both ways, and I struggled both ways to understand exactly what his purpose was here. For through the law, I died to the law.
Jesus came to fulfill the law. And once it was fulfilled, Paul, coming through that same understanding, or coming to a true understanding of that, it's to the point where, in a sense, he has been through the law himself, because he was subject to it as a Jew.
Right.
And now it's fulfilled, and therefore...
Yeah, and I think, as I'm trying to recall, I can picture where they are on the page. What the point that I was going to try to make about this, at the very least, is that it's not as though the law of Moses did not point to faith. Okay, so my impression from this, not dissimilar to what Dad just said, was the idea that, look, if you're honest about reading the law of Moses, you will see that there is an emphasis on faith here. Okay. So it's not that we're negating it altogether. The law was necessary to move us forward. Again, chapter 3 and Romans, when we get there. In the second half, so that I might live to God. See, and the reason I struggle so much with this verse is that this verse really gets into they weren't justified, but they were potentially justified under the old law, and that's a difficult subject for me to communicate well based upon my understanding of it. Lee is glaring at me.
I'm listening.
You're listening. You might want to stop that too. If you don't mind, I'll move on. I might come back to this verse once I've had a chance to refresh my memory a little bit more on that. 20. I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. To live to God is to be dead to the law of Moses. That's the point of making context, but also sin. Romans 6:11 talks about that. Let me just go ahead and turn back there to make sure I've got that one correct. Should I have the marker on here? These business cards ought to make it. Romans 6:11. Even so, consider yourselves to be dead to sin, but alive to God in Jesus Christ. That is concept for concept, the same thing there. And there's a portion of 2 Corinthians as well that discusses this idea of now that Christ has died for us and is in heaven, we should live as though he was living here on earth and accomplishing those things for him as best we can. We're dead to the law of Moses. We are dead to sin. We are dead to the world. Romans 6:2. As I just read a moment ago, may it never be, how shall we who died to sin still live in it? So, in this way, Christ lives through us. He died on our behalf, so we live on his behalf. Christ died for us. We live for Christ. Notice the motivator should always be love. I live by faith in the Son of God. This is the end of verse 20 of chapter 2. Who loved me and gave himself for me. So, how do we live on Christ's behalf? However that is, it's going to look like love. We know that much from this. And then 21, I do not nullify the grace of God, For if righteousness came through the law, then Christ died needlessly. So if we're living as though we are, Christians, this is not what the word means, but little Christs, if we're living like Christ would have lived were he still on the earth, in light of the fact that we have been saved through his death, burial, and resurrection, have we nullified his grace? In other words, is grace associated with the law of Moses only? Absolutely not. If righteousness came through the law, then Christ died without cause. So, an implication of the concept of obeying laws that man has created, or the law of Moses. I like Colossians 2:20, so when I discuss those things, like with James's family and all that, one of the things I ask them is this concept. Have you considered the fact that by obeying these little laws that are going to save you, you've said to Jesus, that whole crucifixion thing, that kneeling to the cross, all that stuff, what was that for if the size of your head covering or how far your dress is from the floor is what actually accomplishes your salvation? Because they'll get pretty close to admitting it almost in those words sometimes, depending on who you're talking to. And at this point, when you get there in that conversation, that it gives them pause and we move on to other things for a little while, because that's a tough thing to try to face, the fact that these things aren't just worthless or unhelpful or unnecessary or to no good effect, but that they're also kind of shoving your finger in Jesus' eye and saying, I found a better way.
Nobody in here should want. That's not something anybody would want to do.
Right. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody intends to do that. Shall I move on from 21? So if they did, why did Christ? Oh, yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. Colossians 2:20, right? Yes, Jonathan.
In my extreme limited experience, it seems like, specifically with like the Baptist types around here, and I assume in other places, who, in my opinion anyway, kind of almost seem to put the focus on Jesus almost to the detriment of the Father.
Mm-hmm.
Like praying exclusively to Jesus, that kind of stuff. Whether whatever your view of that is, it's like Jesus, and the Old Testament is still every bit as fantastic as it ever was, and we have to follow it, all kinds of stuff. This and Jesus himself saying, I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. Okay, well, if he didn't fulfill it, if it's fulfilled, it's gone. So you're saying if it's still there, he failed, and you put Jesus on a pedestal, and he should be on a pedestal. Right. He is God,
different pedestal.
Not that pedestal.
Yeah, you hold him up as everything that he ought to be, and then you, like you were saying, you just poke him in the eye and say, but the thing that you came to fulfill hasn't been fulfilled, and I'm still going to do that.
Throughout Israel's history, as we are studying in Isaiah, the prophecy of a spiritual kingdom was couched in physical terms. And so for thousands of years, they have been living under a fleshly concept here. So, the life that I now live in the flesh, are we spiritual people? We always were. We always were. And he's admitting in verse 20 that life goes on in the flesh. It goes on in the flesh. But that being the case, our behavior changes. It's still almost fleshly behavior, but it's with spiritual design, spiritual purpose. The point that you just made, I think I'm going to say something very similar to that at the bottom of the next slide. I don't know if it's the next one or not. So let's hit some applications about justification here for a moment before we go on to chapter 3. Justification only becomes possible through Christ. I should have asterisked that a little bit. That is absolutely true. Again, people that obediently obeyed the law of Moses, were potentially justified. Have that conversation with Lee another time. But it's not through works of the law of Moses. You cannot be saved through those works, nor through other works of personal merit. Now, how often are we accused of requiring works of personal merit when we discuss the concept of baptism?
Yeah, the same thing.
Right. Lee, I'm thinking of merit in terms of like a merit badge. You're not kicked out of the Boy Scouts for doing the right thing, but you earn extra. Perhaps I should look into that word better.
I missed the first part of your statement. I'm trying to process the first part. I'm a little slower than you.
Okay, well, yes, John.
We can't earn our salvation by doing good works. We are required to do good works,
Right.
period, because of Christ, that's what Christ said. But nothing we do is going to wash away the sins we've done. The blood of Christ.
People go through a lot of hoops to try to reconcile the works, the faith. Sometimes I feel a little bit like no, I won't say that. Let me back up. So I know somebody who believes that you are saved by faith only, absolutely only. Once your behavior changes afterwards, you're saved, period. But the point of verses like this is to say, get a load of this, that as you do good works, you rack up brownie points for literally, at least, okay, so literally, a bigger house. Like, a Hilton lady across the street, well, that's good for another 40 feet on the veranda or whatever. I mean, that's how they balance those things together. You are saved by faith absolutely alone, and if you just want to make sure you got a really good address in heaven, do those works, and you're building stuff. It's kind of like the televangelist faith seed thing. You know what I'm talking about? Send us your money, and it's going to come back to you stuff. That's kind of where that. What are you thinking, Dad?
I just, in this area, I always go back to works of obedience and
Right.
works of merit.
Right.
Because that's the distinction, and it's a distinction that the faith-only folks struggle with, I think. I think it's pretty obvious, but when you say, I believe in Jesus, I believe in Jesus, I believe in Jesus, but when Jesus says, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved, well, I don't believe that. Well, if you believe in Jesus, you have to believe that.
Right.
Because that's what he said.
Right.
And if you don't, then you really don't believe in Jesus. No, if you do that, you're earning your way. Well, whoever told you you're earning your way to heaven by being obedient? I don't know where they ever got that.
Right.
It's a sick.
Yeah, I suppose.
So, any claims to the contrary, I think it is this slide, John, attempt to negate the following things. Christ's death, first of all. 21, if I do not nullify the grace of God, I do not nullify the grace of God. If righteousness comes to the law, then Christ died needlessly. And God's plan. Okay? What are you going to do about the prophets? This becomes fascinating in 3 and 4. Okay? His point in a lot of the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of 4 is, what do you do with Abraham, who's pre-law of Moses? And he is your father and justified, and, what do you do with that? And so clearly God has this plan that comes way before Christ, and you can see the hints of it. He quotes it. We're going to get into Habakkuk in a minute or two, right? What do you do with this stuff? Are you trying to just suggest that this didn't mean what it said? So if Christ's death was necessary, not in vain, is contact with his death necessary? This is not the point he's making right here, but here we are. Didn't know who was going to be here this morning. Romans 6. Yes. Yes, it is. It is necessary, and how do you go about that? Is baptism necessary? This is the verse Lee and I have been discussing a little bit here and there. If Christ's death, if his crucifixion was a necessary part of what was going on here, 1 Corinthians 1:13. Has Christ been divided? Paul was not crucified for you, was he? And the point there being, somebody had to be crucified, and it wasn't me. Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? Contact with his death is necessary. That is accomplished through baptism. Romans 6 and 1 Corinthians 1 make that point. Romans 6 explicitly, 1 Corinthians 1:13 by assumption. There's no logical way around that. And here we go. I think this is what you were talking about a moment ago, John. So, do we hear this baptism doesn't justify because it is a work? Yes, we hear that. But what's the point that Paul's addressing right now? Baptism doesn't justify because it isn't a work. That's what he's kind of dealing with at the moment. Isn't that right? So, yeah, I know.
It's not a work of the law.
It's not a work of the law, right? And that's what they were fighting here. So I'm playing with my words here. Yeah, good job, Brian. I'm playing around with my words. They're suggesting that because it's not a work of the law, it must not justify. They're not explicitly saying this, but they're saying what justifies you? The works of the law. So circumcision and more is what justifies you, And so if you're justified by those other things, Paul's point is baptism doesn't justify because it isn't work. That's, again, not what he says here explicitly, but that's what he ends up saying. That doesn't justify because it doesn't work. I'm trying to think here and apply this to make sure. I'm not sure I've ever had to have a discussion with somebody
Well, the bottom one, no.
that believes this. I'll just point that out.
Because they would all say it's work.
Right.
Because they're all up here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Any other comments on this before we move on?
You said, that Paul goes over the same point over and over and over and over. And you made the reason why, just a minute ago, they've been under this covenant
Right.
for
A very long time,
100
right.
years. That's all they know. And I mean,
Well, and it's
when we talk to people who have heard faith only for I don't know how many years, to get them to
Realize, yeah.
I was thinking about habit yesterday. Janice and I were in town getting some shopping done, and we happened to be at the intersection of, is it Massey and Arsenal? At 3:57. Do you know what happens at the corner of Massey and Arsenal at 4 o'clock? Mass at St. Patrick's. Okay, Saturday Mass. And that parking lot was packed. It starts at 4, it was 3:57, and everybody was in the parking lot, walking in the doors. When we first moved up here, I stopped in there one time when they were having Mass, just because I wanted to see the building, and I didn't know when it was open or whatever. And it's amazing to me. This is totally unfair. Coming from the outside, I'm sitting there driving and, I'm so much better than they are. Please don't quote me on that, but you just kind of, I struggle with that attitude sometimes, and we're sitting there at the stoplight, and they're walking like zombies. And I'm sure I probably look that way to people out here, because I show up, it's 15 minutes till, and everybody knows that George is going to show up in the parking lot at, 9:45. And so this reflects on everybody in terms of making sure that we're paying attention to what we're doing and why we're doing it. But there is false teaching that goes on there, and those people are not thinking some of this stuff all the way through. And there was some regret in my heart as I watched this happen and knew that at 4. Because they end at like 4:30, and by 4:32, that parking lot will be empty again, and they will have done what they're supposed to. And so, but they've been doing it for generations that way. And yeah, go ahead.
Not to harp on the Catholic, but you brought it up. If you talk to people about if you talk to them how are you saved, or all this other stuff.
Or the priest, yeah.
I don't even worry about that. I let the priest handle that.
Let the priest handle that, right?
You got to study it for yourself.
So, we go to people who are like us. And what I mean by that is that we all have lived with many habits that are right or wrong, or beliefs that are right or wrong, or lack of belief that is always wrong. And those things become instilled in us, and we get used to them, and we find the same parking lot spot in the parking lot at church, and we go through the actions without thinking. And I used to say, I don't say it as much, I still kind of believe that change for change's sake isn't good, and I certainly still believe that's true in terms of politics and policy. But sometimes maybe it is good as long as we are still within the boundaries of what God authorizes us to do, to make a change for the sake of waking up again and remembering, that's why we do that, not just how we do that. Perhaps that is putting out a crutch for us to do that. We should have an active mind all the time, but it is easy to fall into habits. Okay, you foolish Galatians. This is my title here because it's supposedly the theme, and it's the verse that everybody remembers and all that. 1 through 6, let's just go ahead and read that. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. This is the only thing I want to find out from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish, having begun by the Spirit? Are you now being perfected by the flesh? Did you suffer so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? So then, does he who provides you with the Spirit and works miracles among you, do it by the works of the law or by hearing with faith? I'll stop there for a moment. So if he has been recounting his conversation with Paul through verse 21, he now goes on in verse 3 and says, and so is the same for you. Paul acted hypocritically because he knew the truth, he was behaving with the truth, he was working with the truth. I knew that when we were in Jerusalem together. And you had the truth, Peter, yeah. And now here you are, and you had the truth, Did you suffer so many things in vain? That means they were suffering. This is verse 5, 4. You were suffering on behalf of the truth, and now you're not behaving in the truth anymore. What's the deal? Something here has changed. Same situation. I'm addressing you now. Notice the word bewitched here. False teaching requires deceit. And we know that in terms of a passive deceit. For something to be false, it therefore must not be true. But it takes an active work, an effort, to fool someone into believing something that is contradictory somewhere along the line. And I think the word bewitched there is a good word to encapsulate that concept. As you go, somebody is trying to trick you here. Who has done this? And so in these 6 verses, and that's probably why, because verse 6 is making a point about the question of verse 5. So there's 6 verses here with these questions. 1, so was Christ crucified? Yes, and not only was he crucified, but before you Galatians, before whose eyes? At the very least, you could say, was publicly portrayed. In other words, you are receivers of first-hand accounts, or perhaps even some of you might have been and saw. There might have been somebody present in that group. I can't absolutely assert that, but before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. Okay, go ahead.
One thing is, remember, Jesus told his apostles and Paul as well that you are going to be my witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
And he is speaking just as well as the other apostles, as John had to when he wrote his letters. Why should you believe this? Because we witnessed this. We saw this take place, and that makes a big difference. It makes a big difference when you recognize, and you were there. Paul was there when that took place. We just don't see where, because in the book of Acts it shows things. But like I said, it does make it, when he describes himself as an apostle, he also was there giving accounts, and he was a Pharisee at that time. But the thing is that should make something for the Christians that are here in Galatia. They should respect that and understand that this wasn't something we're deceiving you with.
Right.
This isn't a story, but this is the account that actually took place.
They're contemporaries of the event. We know that Saul is certainly on the scene by Acts 7, and we get the impression that probably before that it's possible he was present, though not as a Christian. Okay, when this took place. But again, he's made the point through chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2 here that, hey, Christ revealed stuff to me directly.
Exactly.
So, was Christ crucified? Obviously, yes. And he's asking this in a sense of hyperbole. Yes. Or no, if the hyperbolic response would be no. Verse 3, why suffer if the law of Moses is enough? Your own behavior is inconsistent with what has fooled you. In other words, Paul is saying to them, look at your own behavior. You, member of the Church of Galatia, stand right here, okay? 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 weeks ago, were you functioning a particular way? Yes, I was. Okay, are you functioning a different way now? Yes. Are those two things inconsistent? Yes, they are. Okay, you're being deceived. Something happened here. He doesn't really have to go any farther than them as their own person for them to recognize, look, whoa, something's not lining up here. Something's not matching. Okay, if we worked so hard, if we had so much zeal for the truth before, and now we are behaving in a way that is not in line with the truth, whoop, 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 deception somewhere. Note, even though strong enough to suffer for Christ can be torn down by false teachers. Look over at Hebrews really quickly. Hebrews 2:1. For this reason we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away from it, as he's exhorting them there. And Hebrews is a very different book than Galatians is. But it's interesting to see that some of the encouragement in terms of what to watch out for, how to modify, behavior, the emphasis on faith, those things still exist. So, just like Peter could be torn down by peer pressure as he was influenced by the Judaizing teachers when he was in Antioch, so here we need to recognize that the Galatians had zeal. Right? They were doing the right thing and they had suffered for the right thing in verse 4. If you suffer, did you suffer so many things in vain if it is indeed in vain? Okay? Yet they can fall away still as well. So can people who have suffered a great deal, done a lot of work for the sake of the truth and for Christ's word, still fall away? Yes, they can. Yes, they can. At what point in time was the Spirit ever received the law of Moses? Oh, and I'm not sure why I have 3:2. Oh, yeah, 2. This is the only thing I want to find out from you. He's being a little bit sarcastic here, is the impression I get. But yeah, just tell me this one thing. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Acts 2 happens, and then Cornelius happens later. And the question is, when we talk about these things, do we say, and then the apostles practiced the law of Moses even more carefully, and suddenly there was a rushing wind and flames and tongues and all this stuff? No, that's not the case, 5 and 6. So then he who provides you with the Spirit and works miracles among you, does he do it by the works of the law? Is this how you are receiving these gifts that you have now? Because you sacrificed the bull just the way you're supposed to, or did a wave offering or a grain offering, or because you're circumcised? No, that's not how you're receiving these things. And this is why I include 6 here at the beginning, although I did not read it earlier. Even so, Abraham believed, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So this is him hinting at a theme that's really going to hit him hard here as we continue. Pre-law Moses, your favorite patriarch. What are you going to do with that? At what point in time was the Spirit ever received through the law of Moses? That's the way I say that, because this goes beyond Galatians here. Did everybody who practiced the law of Moses accurately during the time of the law of Moses receive miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit? No. Did people before the law of Moses have direct inspiration from God, and were they justified? Yes. Okay, so the specific works of the law never led to the gifts that the Galatians are experiencing now, although prophecy and stuff is happening before. It was not because of the following of the law explicitly in any way at all. So it's just interesting to me to see that covers all times there. That's why I say ever. Now with you, if this is the way it has been, Acts 2, Jews, Gentiles, and Acts 11, 15, Moses, okay. Was he justified by the law of Moses? Did he receive, when he talked to God at the burning bush, this is George speaking here, was it because he was obeying the law of Moses and received this discourse with God? No. It has never been this way. It has never been this way. It wasn't this way with you. You, he who provides you, verse 5, with the Spirit and works miracles among you, does he do it by the works of the law or by hearing with faith? Obviously with faith. It's never been through works of any law that it has been this way. Abraham, in verse 6, Abraham wasn't obeying the law of Moses to obtain his relationship with God that he had.
He was obeying God because he spoke with God.
Right, he spoke with God directly.
He believed, and he placed his faith in him. That's why we're children of God, not Abraham.
So here's the contradiction. He said at the beginning, who has bewitched you? We don't get the who answered. If he has somebody specific in mind, Judaism teachers, okay. But the bewitched part, what is the deceit that's happened here? The contradiction is that they were saved by the Spirit, yet are behaving as though the fleshly law is going to perfect them. Okay? That does not line up logically whatsoever. It is illustrated in a contradiction in behavior, a contradiction in logic, a contradiction in the history as has been received by them throughout, from Abraham on. Okay? It's never worked this way, Dad.
One of the interesting things about Abraham specifically here, and you don't really know in the churches in Galatia how many of the brethren there have a Jewish background, how many were not, or anything else. But by bringing up Abraham, one of the things that's implied, it's not explicit, but it's implied, Abraham left the faith of his fathers when he was believing in Jehovah.
Right.
Okay? That's the faith. And so the implication is the time has come where some of you anyway, well, all of you really, are going to have to leave the faith of your fathers also have faith in Christ for the same reason, in order to please God.
I'm trying to decide if I want to go a little bit further here or not. Better not. Jonathan.
I don't think it's his primary point, certainly, but in 4, did you suffer so many things in vain? So they've been doing what they were supposed to do and suffering in some way because of it, and now they're switching to something else that he says isn't going to do you any good. If you switch over to this other thing, you will have suffered this in the past in vain. But considering that they're trying to make a combination of the two, the new and the old, is their suffering going to stop? I don't think it is. I don't think there's been a period of time since the church was established to now. People are still being persecuted because of being Christians. Thankfully, not so much here. But so not only would their suffering have been in vain, but their continued suffering would be in vain. It's not going to do them any good. Every time I go past an Amish house or an Amish buggy, I think those poor people, because they are loading themselves up with so much hardship in all kinds of ways that's just not necessary. And when they say cast aside every weight, that entangles you, it's not that just cast aside the weights of, temptation to go kill people. If you're loading yourself up with all kinds of other rules that are going to keep you from getting into heaven, you're suffering because of it, and you're still going to fail. Don't do that.
Right. Well, and I mean, we see this illustrated in the prophets all the time, that the people who are being disobedient suffer. Just like the people who are being obedient eventually suffer, may as well do it for the right reasons. My father-in-law in particular likes to point out that he uses the Amish very readily as an example of, look, they're assigning themselves to all these rules that aren't necessary. What's with that? And his reasoning is this: because they don't allow themselves electricity and they're working outside all day, they don't have any light to read the Bible by when they're done working. That's what he says, and that actually could be significantly true. But yes, is there anything else before we go ahead and stop? I'm slowing down because when we get into chapter 4, there's the hardest verse in the entire Bible to deal with. So, at least according to me at the moment, we'll probably get there next week. Appreciate your participation. We've got about 12 minutes before we begin again, so let's try to start at the top of the hour. Thank you so much.
Which verse is that?